Hey guys, how's it going? Avishai here with another episode of What Israel Is. And today I want to tackle what may be literally the question of what Israel is. I want to talk about the Z word. And I'm not talking about zombies. So, what is Zionism? If I were to rely only on what non-Jews or non-Israelis also say, one would seem to think that Zionism is a derogatory term or a racist ideology. And that is not the case. Those of you who might have listened to my previous episode might recall that I referenced that the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, the greatest political cluster within the parliament is the Zionist cluster, and it encompasses the majority of Jewish voices within the parliament, ranging from far right to left. And this is something that is lost on many non-Israelis because they seem to think that Zionism is analogous with the Israeli far right. So what is Zionism anyway? Zionism, well, it comes from the word Zion. And Zion is a biblical word, and it is a synonym for Jerusalem. And Jerusalem here serves as a synecdoche for Israel. So, synecdoche, for those not familiar with the term, a part which relates to the whole or stands in for the whole. So, essentially, Zionism is an ideology of, well, it's tricky, and this is why I'm doing this episode, but I'm trying to kind of compress it to one sentence. An ideology which promotes Jewish, the idea of a Jewish nation state in the land of Israel. But let's go back a bit. Let's go back to where it all begins. And where it all begins is the French Revolution. So, following the French Revolution, there are several radical changes in the French culture, and those impact the entirety of the European culture. So the degree to which it impacts each and every country change. We have a growing enlightenment among the nations, a sense of secularism and a love of knowledge and discourse and the sciences and all of those things which we know and cherish. Those actually preceded and were the cause for the French Revolution. with the French Revolution, we see those ideals, plus the ideals of tolerance and equality, translated into policy. So we have all sorts of these phenomena of equal rights for women, and all of those ratified in law. And part of it was an emancipation of the Jews. It should be noted that even before France, there was a precedent in Poland much earlier, in the 13th century, and that was one of the reasons why Poland was one of the major centers of Jewish life in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and later on in the Renaissance. So the status of Jewish life within France was suddenly changed in such a way that drastically changed the way of life of Jews within France. Suddenly, Jews were allowed to hold political office, and not just that, but have political power at all, such as voting. It is something that needs to be maybe stated that before the Emancipation, Jews had curfews. They were inhibited by all sorts of laws. They had curfews. They had quotas. So there was a number of Jews that were allowed to live in a given country or in a given city. There were certain parts of the city where they were allowed to live in ghettos. In many places, they were not allowed to carry arms, not allowed to learn how to fight, not allowed to practice all sorts of trades. And there was also a matter of, for example, in England before the expulsion, the Jews, the entire population of the Jews, were considered essentially to be property of the crown, and that also encompasses their property. So the king could at any given time divest them of their property. So you can imagine what a drastic change it was for the Jews in Europe to suddenly become part of society at large. But with the Emancipation, and with or closely following this brief age of liberal enlightenment, came the age of nationalism and the idea of the nation state. And here we truly find the birth of Zionism. And nationalism served as a catalyst for Zionism in two ways. The first and most obvious is as a role model, but it also served as a catalyst for Zionism in that with nationalism we see a return with vengeance of anti-Semitism. Because whereas previously we have anti-Semitism rooted strictly in religion and religious arguments, here we have anti-Semitism that is rooted on the grounds of belonging. So, the first truly Zionist movement we see in Eastern Europe, following several pogroms in Eastern Europe, such as in Odessa, but also later on in Chisinau in Moldova. We have several Eastern European Jews, primarily of Russian or from the Russian Empire at the time, who were educated on Western European values. And they, in the beginning, thought that those pogroms and instances of violent anti-Semitism were a passing thing, but as they piled on, they came to a conclusion that this is an epidemic, and a terminal one at that. And so they, one of them, one by the name of Pinsker, Judah Leib Pinsker, he wrote a manifesto by the name of Auto Emancipation. Essentially, the need to cut off ties with the Europeans for good and as soon as possible, and the need to found a Jewish nation state in the ancestral land of Israel. The choice of Israel was non-committal at the point, but preferred, because there was a connection, and a very deep one at that. It needs to be stated that Israel, and Jerusalem specifically, is a very big part of Judaism. It figures into prayers and poems throughout Jewish history for all of Jewish history, essentially. Whenever we have we hold the Passover feast, we recite next year in a constructed Jerusalem. And these are words, even though Jerusalem is already constructed, these are words that were recited throughout the ages of the diaspora. So the first people to come to the conclusion that is Zionism were Eastern European Jews, because that is where anti-Semitism was most rampant at the time. And at that time, the Jews of Central and Western Europe were still rather complacent and would continue to be so for many years to come. Life was more convenient for them in Western and Central Europe. Generally speaking, it appeared that the population at large was more tolerant of them, and they were able to find better roles within society and better jobs, and a shift begins following in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, and this is all in the 19th century. And in the wake of that war, a French Jewish officer by the name of Alfred Dreyfus is tried for treason. He is said to be to have passed crucial information to the Germans, and he is stripped of his ranks and exiled. One journalist who covers the story is a Hungarian Jew, though he was more Austrian culturally speaking, by the name of Theodor Herzl. And following the trial, he comes to the conclusion that Dreyfus was not given a fair process, and that lying underneath the public opinion and the conclusion of the trial were deep-seated hatred of Jews. And this brings him to spurs him into action. And the action here was the assembly of the first Jewish Congress. Essentially, really wasn't the first, because prior to that we have the first Aliyah, the people from Eastern Europe who assembled a Congress and, as I said, already started to settle in the land, land of Palestine. Here I'll make a short diversion to just clarify something, because I've seen a false map that is being spread across the internet of the land of Palestine. So Palestine is a very ancient word, which is essentially synonymous to Israel or Judea. It was a word, we have references to it in ancient Greek literature, but essentially it is not a word that implies a nation state. It is a place name. And it has nothing to do with the people living there. That's just a qualification. So the British mandate of Palestine, for example, is not the mandate of the Palestinians. It's just the name of the place. And this goes the same for the Provincia Palestina of the Romans. So as I said, we have the first Zionist assembly, the first Zionist Congress, in which they came to the Jews of Europe, those who attended, came to the conclusion of, or the former decision of building a nation state for the Jews in Palestine through political means and through contact with the powers. Herzl was very hardworking in his contact with all the major powers who were relevant. So he was in contact with the German Kaiser and with the Ottoman authorities, and also with the British Empire. And the last one is the one that eventually paid off, though a bit posthumously for Herzl, as after the land of Palestine came under the power of the British Empire following the victory in the First World War. One Lord Balfour issued a declaration in the name of the king that the king recognizes the ancestral right of the Jewish people to found a home within the land of Palestine. And it is this declaration which eventually led to the recognition in the land of Israel. This marks the end of this episode about what Zionism is. I might do a follow-up to maybe give a little more background as to the Zionist project. Until next week, we'll have an awesome week, and I'll see you guys next time.